You've mentioned the importance of identifying priorities and allocating resources according to those priorities. And clearly that also will involve some monitoring and evaluation. I would like to ask you to comment on some of your own work where you've spent time in defining principles that should guide the budget process. In other words, for the process itself to be effective, it should be guided by, you cite 10 principles: comprehensiveness, discipline, legitimacy, flexibility, predictability, honesty, transparency, and accountability. Are certain of these 10 principles particularly important for countries that are affected by conflict? And in particular, since you work with donors, does external financing through donor grants or loans, but external financing by the nature of the relationship and the way that the funds are dispersed, does that pose special problems for some of the principles that you've stressed as being central to a sound government, both procurement and budgeting process?
Yeah, I think it's first let me just say that the principles you've just mentioned they're not my principles. They are the principles of sound financial management, and you'll find them in World Bank handbooks and so on and so forth. So, but I think it's also important to understand that these principles really embody goals that one should have in front of oneself as a guide. And no public expenditure on this earth, all of these, in the security sector or in the non-security part of the public sector. And achieving these principles is really a work in progress everywhere, including in this country. So it is something very much to have in front of you and use as a guide. At the same time, there's no justification for the security sector to violate any of those principles, and the way in which it implements them may be a bit different in the security sector than in other sectors, but the principles themselves should not be violated. Now, that said, I think that it's particularly important in post-conflict settings, as you said, to emphasize the importance of transparency and accountability, because these most likely will not have been very much in evidence in the preceding period, particularly as far as the security sector is concerned. And we know from our own experience that shining a light into dark corners is really very, very important in ensuring the appropriate use of state resources. And we have all sorts of mechanisms for doing that, ranging from the media to the Government Accountability Office and all sorts of things, and congressional hearings and so on and so forth. A lot of this is not well developed, certainly in post-conflict countries. But at the same time, I mean, one emphasizes accountability and transparency, but they're a little bit like apple pie and motherhood at this point, because everybody knows in principle that accountability and transparency are the cornerstone not only of sound financial management of the security sector, but of security policy in general. And I think that there are two other principles that one should give particular attention, and the first is comprehensiveness. And that means that the budget should encompass all the fiscal operations of government so that off-budget expenditure and revenue are prohibited. And this would include resources supplied by donors. And here one does have a huge problem of both of comprehensiveness and of transparency, because very often one doesn't know exactly what. I mean, in the case of Afghanistan, for example, the U.S. provides huge billions of dollars a year amount of money to support the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, and they will give you a gross figure, and they will not tell you what the breakdown is beyond that. And I can think of a few reasons why they might do that, but none of them are terribly good, I don't think. Some of them may have to do with concerns about security, but I think that it's really important to understand that concerns about security do not justify hiding levels of expenditure from one's own people or the people receiving it either. And the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan does have some problems in finding out exactly what is spent. Now, the second additional principle I think that one should consider in these situations is discipline, which means that the decision-making must be restrained by resource realities over the medium term. The budget should absorb only those resources necessary to implement government policies, and budget allocation should be adhered to. And this is extremely important in conflict-affected countries because they are typically highly resource constrained. So it really, and everything seems like a priority, and everybody wants to spend money on everything. But in reality, you can't do that. So I would add those to comprehensiveness and discipline, as well as transparency and accountability.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments that you would like to make on the issues of development and security sector reform, and with particular relevance to countries that have been affected by conflict?
Well, I just would like to actually say a few words on ownership of reform processes. Okay, the word ownership is somewhat overworked these days. Everybody in the development community, anyway, talks about ownership. But the concept behind it is extremely valid. And I just would like to sort of to note something that my South African colleague, Laurie Nathan, has written on this subject. And it pertains to the relationship between reforming governments and countries on the one hand, and donors who provide a lot of resources for whatever reforms there are on the other hand. And what he has said is that the reform of security policies, institutions, and activities in a given country must be designed, managed, and implemented by local actors rather than external actors. And the principle is, he says, is misconstrued if it is understood to mean that there must be a high level of domestic support for donor activities. What is required is not local support for donor programs and projects, but rather donor support for programs and projects initiated by local actors. The question for donor governments is not how can we undertake SSR in partner countries, but how can we support local actors who want to undertake SSR in partner countries? Now, in conflict-affected countries, this can be very difficult because there's a perceived need that one has to move quickly. And this is institutional reform that is particularly politically sensitive in environments where the political rules of the game are far from agreed. And therefore, it's going to take a long time to get to the point where a reform process can go forward. And very often the donors, as I'm sure you know, put their money on the table and they want to see results yesterday, if not maybe tomorrow, but really very, very quickly. And it's simply not realistic. And ownership very often in those circumstances goes by the board. And I think that means that the reforms that we may be spending quite a lot of money on will not be sustainable. And
in part because what you've described is institutional reform, that reconstruction is not a matter of building roads or buildings, but it's a matter of building state institutions. I hark back to words of Nasser Saidi, who was economy minister in Lebanon during the period of their rebuilding the economy, who said that reconstruction is about state building. And I think that you've given us some very useful insights in terms of how security sector reforms and budgeting reforms, public financial management reforms, more broadly defined, can be a very important part of state building and institutional reconstruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you.